I want to talk about SUDS, Sustainable Drainage Systems. This is not going to be a primer, an explanation of all about sustainable drainage. There's lots of websites you can go to for information on SUDS. I suppose where we start is that certainly large floods where cities, towns like Carlisle and Tewkesbury get flooded, they certainly make the headlines, but really it's urban flooding, which is probably lower scale, smaller scale, but more prevalent, more frequent, potentially more damaging to the infrastructure, and leads to overloads of our sewage systems, and then that leads to more input into rivers and therefore more flooding. In the old days we used to live with water. Water was seen as a resource. Floodplains were seen as an important agricultural resource, certainly in terms of the cyclical nature of seasons and so on. But with urbanisation, water was then seen as a problem. The engineering challenge was to get it off the surface as quickly as possible, get it away as quickly as possible, and if we're quite honest, make it somebody else's problem. And certainly we can see that in Victorian sewers, where they were made as big as possible to take both foul water and surface water away to be treated centrally, or actually just leaked out into the sea or to the river. The situation now is that we have more and more impermeable surfaces in towns and cities. So things like roofs, car parks, roads, pavements and so on and so forth. And that's just increasing the amount of runoff that's coming into our sewers. Now, sewers full to capacity, so the overload happens, and what happens is then you get back up from the sewers and you get local flooding. With SUDS, Sustainable Drainage Systems, the principle is to manage at or near the surface, as close to the source as possible, and really all that is very sound. But there's some issues. I'm not offering solutions, I'm just raising issues here. The first one is that we're trying to match what nature does in terms of water permeating into the ground and controlling the amount that runs off into rivers, etc. Problem there is that that gets taken into mimicking nature as close as possible. So therefore we come into green solutions being the only way to do sustainable drainage. Well, putting nice big detention ponds, swales, whatever, is, if it can be done, is very good and looks very good and improves the amenity and biodiversity. But it's not always possible. The land take for doing these things can be quite high, and so therefore a development may not take place because too much land needs to be given over to these green solutions. And also it's not possible to infiltrate, in other words, have water permeate into the ground in all areas, where there's heavy clays, for example, or where there's contaminated land and we don't really want the water going through into the aquifer beneath. Second one is that SUDS approval now sits with the planning department. Under the initial plans for sustainable drainage, that would not have been the case, but from April of this year, 2016, it certainly sits within the normal planning application. And the concern is, will they have the resources, will they have the capability, will they have the knowledge to actually create or approve SUDS schemes in the same way that they would have been under the proposed SUDS approval bodies? The other part that comes out of the change in the legislation was that SUDS approval body would have been adopting the SUDS scheme and would have been responsible for the maintenance ongoing. Okay, there were issues in terms of how that would be costed and how that would be paid for. But because there's now no statutory adoptee, it's no longer clear who's responsible for the ongoing maintenance. And equally, who's responsible for monitoring that the ongoing maintenance is happening. Question: are we storing up problems for a future generation or even for only 10 or 20 years' time? The other thing that comes out from the planning process is that the SUDS scheme is only looked at within the limits or the boundaries of the development being considered. There will be some runoff, that has to be allowed for, and that will have an additive effect with other sites which are also being considered. Now that additive effect is not being taken into account necessarily by the planning process. It would be possibly taken up by the lead local flood authority, but at the moment the coordination between the two is not clear. The fifth issue is really to do with the non-statutory guidelines which were issued this year in April 2016. Originally, the standards for creation of SUDs were quite a thick document, etc., went into quite a lot of detail. We now have a 2-page non-statutory guideline, and that concentrates on quantity and flow rate control. There's nothing in there about quality, and certainly there is very little guidance coming into the planning system about how you improve the quality of, for example, runoff from a car park which may have pollutants on it or anything like that. The 6th issue is that small developments are exempt from the process, anything less than 10 houses or 10,000 square metres. Now, whether or not we believe that climate change is happening, if we're exempting the smaller ones, then the situation can only get worse. So what we need to do is we need to start nibbling, i.e. retrofitting. So that could mean rain gardens in urban streets, it could mean pocket parks, it could mean the design of public open spaces being more water resistant. And that leads on to the last issue that I see, which is that we need to accept that whatever we design a scheme to in terms of the rainfall intensity, the rainfall period, etc., at some point it will probably fail. A perfect storm will happen. The ground will be saturated, so infiltration is not possible. The storm is a 1 in 150 year storm, whatever that means. And we need to have the possibility of exceedance, in other words, overpowering of what our design has been designed for. And we need to make sure that the exceedance fails and causes the least damage. And also, where it fails, that we get the fastest recovery. Sounds a bit like a floodplain, which is where we really started off. So, summarise. We need to match nature, not slavishly mimic it. We need to question the SUDS approval process within the planning authorities, how they get the capability and resource. Maintenance, the question of who maintains and who monitors the maintenance is an ongoing question. The additive effect of SUD schemes in urban areas. The non-statutory guidelines concentrating on quantity, not quality. Small developments being exempt, so we need to have nibbling, retrofitting, and the big one for the future is resilience and designing for exceedance. Thank you.